8 days away from Christmas, if you can believe it. The third Sunday of Advent already. And it's a really good time on the third Sunday of Advent to ask ourselves just a pretty simple but direct question, which is, how's it going? How has Advent been going for you? For me, the answer that I have is the answer that I always have about this time of year, which is, by golly, really, really fast. Advent's been going really fast. We get these sort of 4 weeks, which seem to go so quickly because they seem so brief to us. And we get this interesting moment on the third Sunday out of the 4 where we get to wear these different color vestments. And the church gives us this command to rejoice. And in the scriptures, we listen to a very sort of a particular story. Normally, when we listen to the Gospels, we listen to a section from the life of Jesus. But today, instead, we hear a section from the life of John the Baptist. Now, that's kind of strange in a way. And it's a really interesting but important part of John the Baptist's life because I think it helps to put into better context what you're doing on the 17th of December in 2023. John the Baptist, we know, is the cousin of Jesus. He is the forerunner of the Messiah. And he has been making somewhat of, we'll say, a local name for himself because he's been beyond the river, this strange, wild man, baptizing people, preaching repentance, and everyone's trying to find out who this guy is. So he's got quite this crowd, and evidently the religious leaders, the priests, the Levites, and even some of the Pharisees themselves are now going to confront John, which we listen to today in this conversation between these religious men. And they're going to ask John, as we listen to the passage, 2 very specific questions. Because they're all Jewish men. They all know about the history of their people, and they're all very well versed in the Hebrew scriptures. And they're asking John to identify himself. And so they say to him, John, are you Elijah? And are you the prophet? These are very specific questions. Everybody perhaps knows of the name Elijah. Elijah is one of the great figures of the Old Testament. He lived about 8.5 centuries before this conversation between John and his contemporaries. And Elijah was known to be, as it were, like the pinnacle of the entire prophetic tradition. He was very powerful and magnificent in what graces God gave to him. At his command, God gave him the power even to refuse rain from the earth. He was even known to have raised someone from the dead. These were things that were certainly nobody had the power to do them, but even amongst the prophets, this was a very prolific person, Elijah. And in the prophetic tradition, it was prophesied that Elijah would return one day, and upon his return, would inaugurate the coming of the promises of God. And John says, no, I'm not Elijah. And they say, well, are you the prophet? And the prophet, when they were talking about the prophet, they're also speaking out about a specific person. And that person was Moses. Amongst all of those whom God sent to the people of Israel, there was one who was called the prophet. Amongst all the prophets, the prophet. The first, the greatest among them all, the one who inaugurated the whole thing, Moses. Now, Moses lived 13 centuries before this particular conversation between John and his contemporaries. And it was even in Moses' own day that there was this recognition that he was different, that he who was graced to receive the law from God to give to the people was one who was, again, going to be his posterity was going to be a gift, a continued gift from God to his people. And so as Moses was going to end his life, we actually have a recording of what happened at the end of his life. This is in the book of Deuteronomy, which is right before Moses dies. And here at the end of Moses' life, when he's giving his final testament to the people, he, among many things, he says this, and I can find it. As I have my phone out in church. This is what Moses says to the people. A prophet like me will the Lord your God raise up for you from among your own kindred. That is the one to whom you shall listen. This is exactly what you requested of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, 'Let us not again hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, lest we die.' And the Lord said to me, Moses, 'What they have said is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their kindred, and I will put my words into the mouth of the prophet. The prophet shall tell them all that I command, and anyone who will not listen to my words, which the prophet speaks in my name, I myself will hold them accountable for it.'" And at the end, after he dies, the very closing words of the Torah, the very closing lines of the book of Deuteronomy are these: "And since then, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom God knew face to face. In all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants, and against all his land, and all the great might and the awesome power that Moses displayed in the sight of all Israel." It was known that Moses was the most humble man that walked the earth, and he knew the Lord as his friend face to face, and this is what enabled him to receive the law of God for the people. And this became a promise in general of the prophetic tradition that would follow. God would send prophets to speak in his name. But in the time of John the Baptist, these lines were kind of like a messianic prophecy as well. That the prophet, the one who came in the power of Moses, would be the one who came in the power of Elijah would be the one to finally fulfill God's promises. And so we enter back into this conversation, and they say, "John, rank yourself. Tell us who you really are. Do you claim to be on equal status as these two lofted men that God has raised up?" And so John answers his contemporaries in the same way that his cousin Jesus would do so, which is not by giving them the answer they really want, but by giving them the answer that they need. Because they have asked John, "Are you important? Rank yourself." And John says, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, because he knows the scriptures, he says, "Let me tell you who I am. I am the voice of one, the messenger who cries out in the desert, 'Prepare the way of the Lord.'" And that prophecy from Isaiah was also in reference to the time that the Messiah would come. And so John, in effect, says, "You're asking me who I am, but I'm telling you what time it is." And the real question is not, who am I? The real question is, do you recognize the time of your visitation? Because if I speak to you and respond to you in the voice of the prophet Isaiah, you should know by that reference who I am, and thereby who is now among you. And the tragic part about it is he says, "But you do not recognize the one who is among you, the strap of whose sandal I am not even worthy to untie." And so John asks the Pharisees, the priests, and the Levites the same question that God asks us, the church asks us on the third Sunday of Advent. And the question is, how's the time been? How's it been for you? Do you recognize the moment that you're living in? They were all very well aware that it had been 8.5 centuries since Elijah. It had been 13 centuries since Moses. And the people of God were waiting a long, 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 long time to finally find out when God would fulfill his promise. And when the time finally arrived, guess who missed it? The ones who were supposed to have their eyes open. They missed it. And it reminds me and reminds us of this really important lesson learned from the Gospels. And in fact, this was one of the most important lessons that I've ever learned from my mom and dad as we grew up as kids. One of the things that they would say to us all the time was this. They said, "You have to remember, you're a steward. We're stewards. We're a steward of everything that we have. In other words, everything is on loan to you. We don't really own anything. We're just given it for now. And one day we have to give everything back. And the question is going to be, how will we have used all of the things that God has loaned to us? Will we have been good stewards of those gifts? My health is on loan to me. My family relationships, on loan to me. The clothes on my back, the bed that I sleep in, the food that I eat, the roof that I sleep under, on loan to me. One day I have to give all of these things back to the one who has loaned them to me, who's going to ask me, how'd the time go? Were you able to ask the right questions and seek the right answers? Were you able to recognize the one who is among you in your midst? And and I would have to confess to you all of this. One of the things that is most precious that God gives to us as a loan is the one thing that I forget more often than any other, which is that God loans us our time. Every present moment is God's gift to us that he loans. And there comes a day when we have to give even our time back to God. And God is going to ask us the question, how well did it go? Did you use the time that I gave you well by asking the questions that you should have asked and seeking the answers that you should have been receiving? Or did we find out at the end when all the time is up that we wasted it, that we gave it away, that we were sort of useless with it, that we weren't good stewards of it? It's probably the thing I have to confess more than any other. And so on this third Sunday of Advent, the gospel passage meets us here. When I find day in and day out that I'm probably, by instinct, usually asking the wrong question and usually looking for the wrong answer. Because it's not a question of ranking the day in the hierarchy of what's most important. It's a question of recognizing, do I know my time of visitation? Because this is a gift to me. And God has given, he is creating right now, every present moment that we're living in. The future hasn't been created yet. Until now. All of this is being loaned to us as we live and as we breathe. And we have to be aware that when we are cognizant that this is on loan, we seem to treat things very differently than we did before. If I know that my health is a gift to me, if I know that my family, my friends, all of those relationships are on loan to me for now, if I know that the clothes that I wear and the food that I eat is God's gift to me, I begin to treat those things very differently than if I think I just own the place. But all of us are stewards. And as we make our way through this time, it is the time of our visitation. It is the time when Jesus is already in our midst. And the question is, as John the Baptist asked, do you and I recognize that? Do we see Jesus in everything that we look at, in everyone that is around us, in all of the gifts that we have been given? Or do we let our days pass us by and fiddle away on this thing and on that thing that's not important or that's unhelpful, instead of living a truly joyful life of grace with the Lord in friendship with him? And so when we come to this day and the church says to us, rejoice, why is it so important to rejoice? Because God says, rejoice. I have made this time for you. I have made this for you. Rejoice that you have this moment, this opportunity to seek me, to recognize me, to know me, to love me. That you may not get to the end of your life and say, look at what I have wasted. But that you may come to the end of your life and say, I did not let even a single day pass me by.